On the morning of June 22, 1941, the radio carried Molotov's grave voice across kitchens and communal corridors, war. In provincial towns and big city communality, women heard it while boiling water, patching coats, portioning yesterday's bread. In the archives, evacuation orders, ration ledgers, NKPS rail directives, you see the same pivot in ink: civilian life becomes logistics. The Wehrmacht's strategy was speed: encircle Soviet armies, seize grain regions, rupture rail hubs. Yet the Soviet counterstrategy, often improvised in the first weeks, was to deny capture, move industry east, keep armies fed, keep cities functioning. The front expanded into bread lines and freight yards. A factory foreman's wife becomes a shift boss, a schoolteacher becomes a ration card clerk, a young widow learns to read train schedules like a battlefield. The riddle begins here: when rifles are scarce and roads collapse, what holds a nation together, steel or the hands that measure flour? In late June and July 1941, German armored groups punched toward Minsk and Smolensk, while Soviet planners fought a quieter battle: rail capacity. Declassified GKO resolutions and NKPS memos show frantic triage: locomotives reassigned, civilian travel restricted, evacuation trains prioritized. Women were the human interface of this system. In station photographs from 1941, you can spot them: kerchiefs, bundles, children clinging, eyes fixed on a blackboard of departures that keeps changing. Tactical decisions at the front, whether to hold a line or retreat, directly altered the civilian calculus. A city threatened meant warehouses emptied, bakeries dismantled, cattle herded east. Germany targeted nodes, not just units. Soviet survival depended on restoring nodes faster than bombs could break them. When a rail yard was hit, women and teenagers cleared twisted rails, passed sleepers hand to hand, worked under blackout rules. The war's tempo, blitzkrieg, met a counter-tempo, relentless repair. Every train that moved was a victory, no headline recorded. By August 1941, the Soviet state formalized emergency control through the State Defense Committee, GKO, issuing orders that read like battlefield commands but governed daily life: rationing categories, evacuation quotas, factory relocation. Ration cards, kartaki, became currency more precious than rubles. Women, often assigned as clerks or supervisors in workplaces, enforced the arithmetic of hunger: grams of bread, allocations of fats, the cruel hierarchy of worker versus dependent. German strategy aimed to starve cities through encirclement and capture of agricultural regions. Soviet strategy was to concentrate calories where war production lived. The moral weight fell on the women behind counters: deny a card and you might kill someone, bend rules and you might collapse the system. Diaries preserved in regional archives repeat the same phrase in different hands: I stood in line. A line was not passive, it was a daily mobilization: hours of cold, vigilance against theft, bargaining for scraps. Behind the front, rationing became an internal front: disciplined, contested, and necessary. The greatest logistical gamble began as factories were uprooted. From July through November 1941, entire plants were dismantled and shipped east: machine tools, presses, turbines, often under air raid sirens. Official reports described evacuation of equipment, but letters described the human scene: women loading crates, sleeping on platforms, guarding bolts and bearings as if they were gold. This was strategy in motion: preserve industrial capacity to keep producing T-34 tanks, artillery shells, aircraft engines. Germany expected Soviet production to collapse with the loss of western regions. The Soviets answered by moving the war economy beyond reach, toward the Urals, Siberia, Kazakhstan. Women became the continuity between disassembled and reassembled worlds, keeping records, labeling parts, coaxing production back to life in unheated workshops. The technology story here isn't only the T-34's sloped armor, it's the machine tool ecosystems required to make it, and the human labor that made those ecosystems portable. Each crate lifted was a bullet not yet fired, but already fought for. Then came Leningrad, sealed by land in early September 1941. In siege documents, the language is technical: daily bread norms, fuel stocks, ice road tonnage, but the meaning is brutal. Women formed the majority of the city's civilian workforce as men left for the front or died. They dug anti-tank ditches, staffed air defense posts, and later hauled water when pipes froze. The German operational goal was not merely to capture but to neutralize the city. Starvation became a weapon. Soviet logistics responded with the fragile lifeline across Lake Ladoga, the future road of life. In household notebooks, women tracked calories like accountants of despair. Bread, often cut with fillers, became the measure of time. Yet even inside the siege, production continued: shells, repairs, uniforms. That continuity was strategic defiance. The riddle tightens: when artillery and hunger work together, what fights back? Not only guns, also endurance organized into routines, queues, and ration books, held together by women who kept families and factories from vanishing. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. The winter of 1941 to 1942 arrived like an enemy offensive. As the Red Army halted the Germans outside Moscow in early December 1941, the victory headlines masked a quieter emergency. The rail network was breaking under cold, overuse, and Luftwaffe strikes. NKPS directives complain of frozen switches, locomotive failures, wagons stranded for lack of coal. Women filled the gaps as auxiliary labor, clearing tracks, unloading grain by hand when cranes failed, keeping depot records accurate as trains rerouted hourly. Strategy depended on this. Counteroffensives require ammunition, but also boots, felt, and bread. Soviet factories, newly reassembled east of the Urals, demanded steady inputs they rarely received. In letters from evacuation settlements, women described trading clothing for potatoes, boiling frozen beets, and stitching mittens from rags. The German plan had assumed Soviet society would fracture. Instead it thickened into improvised mutual aid, roommates sharing stove time, neighbors rotating childcare so others could work. The weapon in this season was not firepower, but heat, made by hands that learned to ration not only food, but warmth itself. In early 1942, evacuation became less a movement than a state of being. Millions had already been pushed east in 1941. Now, in the new industrial towns around Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, and Novosibirsk, women rebuild life in barracks and cramped rooms. Archival factory rosters show a striking shift: women and adolescents replacing men in skilled and semi-skilled jobs, lathe operators, welders' assistants, inspectors. Technology shaped their days. Machine tools demanded precision, and production targets demanded speed. The Soviet approach was relentless standardization: simplify parts, reduce wasted motions, push output, because time was a resource measured in lives at the front. German intelligence watched output nervously, trying to gauge whether bombing could cripple this dispersed industry, but distance, camouflage, and Soviet repair capacity blunted the effect. At home, the cost was hunger and exhaustion. A mother who had been a bookkeeper became a metal worker. At night she calculated calories, not columns of rubles. The war economy's miracle ran on underfed bodies, mostly female, that refused to stop moving. Rationing hardened into a system of privilege and punishment. In 1942, official bread norms varied by category. Heavy industry and defense workers received more, dependents and the unemployed received less. The logic was strategic: feed production to feed the army, but it created daily moral combat. Women often stood at the junction of policy and flesh. As workplace clerks, canteen workers, and local administrators, they checked documents, stamped cards, and faced desperate pleas. Black markets expanded where official distribution failed, an economic shadow that both kept people alive and threatened state control. Police reports and court records reveal women arrested for speculation, trading soap, cloth, or bread coupons for grain. The state condemned it, yet the state's own shortages produced it. German strategy targeted Soviet agriculture and transport to force collapse. Soviet internal strategy became a balancing act: tight control without strangling the informal exchanges that prevented starvation. In memoirs, women describe hiding a handful of flour in a scarf, or walking miles to barter for millet. These aren't side stories, they are the micro-logistics that kept laborers alive long enough to keep the factories running. The countryside carried a different burden. With men at the front, Kolkhoz fields in 1942 were harvested by women, old men, and children, often with fewer horses and tractors, because machinery and fuel were pulled toward the army. Agricultural reports show falling yields and rising quotas, a squeeze that forced villages to surrender grain even as they went hungry. Here, technology mattered by absence. One tractor missing meant days of hand labor. One broken belt could doom a harvest window. Women became planners of time, watching weather, organizing brigades, rationing seed. German occupation policies in seized regions added another horror: requisitions, forced labor, and punitive actions that made farming itself a form of resistance. The Soviet state needed grain for cities and the front. It demanded deliveries regardless of local suffering. This tension, state survival versus village survival, runs through petitions preserved in archives, women asking for seed, for a cow returned, for a husband's exemption denied. Strategy on maps depends on calories and sacks. Those sacks were filled by women whose war was fought against soil, quotas, and grief. By summer 1942, Germany shifted south toward the Volga and the Caucasus, case blue, seeking oil and the severing of Soviet transport arteries. The military logic was clear: fuel is operational freedom, take Baku and the Red Army falters. Soviet logistics, reading the threat, tried to protect refineries, reroute rail flows, and accelerate production in safer zones. On the home front, women felt the strategy as scarcity: kerosene rationed, transport delayed, food trains diverted to the threatened sector. Evacuation restarted in waves as the front rolled again, families jammed into freight cars, inventories scribbled on scraps, factory managers begging for wagons. Declassified communications show frantic prioritization: tanks and shells outrank everything, yet everything depends on the workers who build them staying alive. Women were again the glue, keeping children quiet on overcrowded trains, guarding tool crates, reporting to new plants before housing existed. The riddle's answer begins to surface. The strongest weapon was organized survival, women turning deprivation into continuity, so the state could keep fighting when strategy demanded it most. When the battle for Stalingrad ignited in August 1942, it was not only a clash of armies but a collision of supply systems. German 6th Army drove toward the Volga to cut Soviet river traffic and choke the north-south lifeline. Soviet commanders clung to the riverbank because ferries and barges were arteries. In wartime logs and later declassified reports, civilian women appear everywhere in the margins: stevedores hauling sacks at night, nurses ferrying wounded across under shellfire, telephone operators keeping lines patched as buildings collapsed. The city's factories, most famously the tractor plant, became front-line fortresses, producing and repairing armor within range of German artillery. That fusion of industry and combat was strategy made physical. Women, often evaluated late or not at all, learned the tactics of survival: blackout discipline, listening for aircraft, counting seconds between whistle and blast. German air attacks aimed to turn the river crossings into graveyards. Soviet air defense and smokescreens fought back. The front was measured in meters, but the war's outcome hinged on tonnage: how many crates and bodies could still cross the Volga each night. As the siege-like fighting ground on through September and October 1942, Soviet command prepared its reversal. Operation Uranus, launched November 19, 1942. The plan's brilliance was operational: strike the weaker Romanian and Italian flanks, not the hardened German center, then close a ring. But the plan depended on concealment and accumulation, moving divisions, guns, fuel, and winter clothing across a strained network without alerting German reconnaissance. Here logistics becomes a form of espionage, and women often served as its cover. Freight clerks falsified mundane labels, warehouse workers packed crates that looked civilian, medical trains carried more than bandages. Diaries from rear areas describe a sudden tightening of secrecy: fewer questions, more night loading, more guards. German strategy, still focused on taking the city block by block, underestimated Soviet capacity to mass force in the steppe. When the encirclement snapped shut in late November, it shocked not only generals but civilians who had lived under months of bombing. Women in the region then faced a new ordeal, feeding the surge of Soviet troops moving forward and caring for the wounded flooding back. Victory was not an ending, it was an expansion of the home front into the liberated ruins. The winter after Uranus exposed the cold mechanics of war economy. Encircled German forces depended on an airlift that could not meet demand. Soviet forces depended on railheads that crept forward through mud and frost. In Soviet hospitals and field points from December 1942 to January 1943, women nurses and orderlies became logisticians of the body, triage, rationing medicines, sterilizing instruments with scarce fuel. Medical kits were technology too, sulfa drugs, bandages, splints, the simple but decisive ability to prevent infection. Behind them, women in factories faced storm production schedules as the Red Army pressed advantage. Archival production charts show spikes in output paired with discipline orders, absenteeism punished, quotas raised. The state framed it as patriotic necessity, workers experienced it as exhaustion layered on hunger. Yet the strategic payoff was tangible: sustained artillery fire, replacements for burned-out trucks, winter uniforms. German intelligence noted Soviet resilience with frustration, often attributing it to Asiatic endurance, a racist myth that ignored the actual mechanism, a centrally directed but locally improvised system, where women absorbed the shocks, grief, scarcity, displacement, and kept the machines and households functioning. In January 1943, Operation Iskra opened a narrow land corridor to Leningrad along Lake Ladoga, breaking the siege's complete isolation though not ending danger. The official communiques speak of restored communications, but convoy records reveal the real transformation, a trickle becoming a flow, flour, fuel, ammunition, evacuation of the weakest. Women in Leningrad, many already hollowed by the winter of 1941-42, faced a new paradox: relief arrived, but work demands intensified. Factories restarted lines, utilities required repairs, the city had to relearn normality while still shelled. The German strategy of strangulation had failed to force capitulation, yet it still inflicted death by attrition. Soviet strategy, balancing multiple fronts, used the corridor to stabilize the city without diverting decisive forces from the south. In personal accounts, women described the first slightly larger bread ration not as joy but as disbelief, an emotion so guarded it feels like fear. Here, logistics is psychological. When supply becomes reliable, hope becomes possible, and hope itself becomes a weapon against collapse. The riddle's answer sharpens: organization and persistence outlasting a plan built on starvation. By mid-1943, after Stalingrad's aftermath and the grinding winter campaigns, Soviet society had adapted into a brutal equilibrium. The home front was now structured around total mobilization, women as the majority in many workplaces, children as laborers, elderly as caretakers and queue-keepers. Economic reports show the state's constant dilemma: feed the cities that build weapons, feed the countryside that grows food, feed the army that consumes everything fastest. In this balancing act, women served as shock absorbers. They stretched soups, repaired boots, ran communal childcare, and maintained informal exchange networks that official distribution could never fully replace. Covert operations threaded through this world too: partisan detachments supplied from rear depots, couriers moving through villages, women carrying messages and medicine because they drew less suspicion. German anti-partisan tactics, reprisals, burnings, hostage-taking, made such work lethal, yet it expanded as the Red Army advanced. The strongest weapon, at last revealed, was not hidden in a bunker. It was the disciplined, gendered labor of survival, women turning scarcity into continuity, continuity into production, and production into the material power that pushed the front westward. In the files of partisan headquarters from 1942 to 1943, you find women described in the driest terms: courier, liaison, medical orderly, as if the words were harmless. They were not. Behind German lines in Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia, covert operations depended on passing through checkpoints, markets, and villages without drawing fire. Women often could move where armed men could not, carrying pistol parts in bread loaves, maps sewn into hems, medicine hidden under diapers. This was strategy by stealth: sabotage rail lines to slow German supply to the front, disrupt occupation administration, gather intelligence on troop movements. German counterstrategy was terror and control, pass systems, informants, collective punishment. In interrogation protocols and reprisal reports, you see the stakes. One found leaflet could mean a village burned. Yet partisan war also had logistics: ammunition drops, food requisitions, winter shelter, often organized by women who knew every barn and cellar. Their ordinary knowledge of terrain and community became operational advantage. The home front and covert front blurred. The same hands that rationed soup by day could by night ration bullets, because both were supplies measured against time. Technology shaped these hidden battles as sharply as tanks did. Soviet partisans prized compact weapons, captured MP-40s, Soviet PPSH-41 submachine guns, because they were portable and could be fed with scavenged ammunition. Women in detachments learned maintenance: oiling bolts, drying powder, cleaning and freezing smoke huts. Radios were the true treasure. A single set, powered by improvised batteries, could summon an airdrop or warn of a German sweep. German signals units hunted transmissions with direction-finding gear. The contest became mathematical and intimate: how long you dared transmit before moving again. Women operators, trained quickly, tapped out reports under blankets to muffle sound, while guards listened for dogs and engines. Meanwhile, far behind the lines, industrial technology, presses, lathes, foundries, kept pushing out replacements. The Soviet advantage was not elegance, it was scale, repairability, and standard parts, all made under constraint. When historians talk about deep battle and operational art, this is its domestic shadow: a society generating weapons and information simultaneously. The front's sharp edge depended on a rear that could both manufacture steel and whisper coordinates. The moral economy of survival never stopped clashing with state demands. In 1943, as Soviet forces began to regain territory, officials moved in behind the armies to reimpose administration, restore collection quotas, and register labor. Women returning from evacuation or emerging from occupation faced suspicion as well as relief, paperwork, questions, sometimes accusations. Yet reconstruction began immediately: bridges repaired, bakeries restarted, schools reopened in half-roofed buildings. German scorched earth withdrawals and earlier requisitions left villages stripped. Soviet planners prioritized transport routes and grain procurement to feed cities and armies. Here the strategy was forward-looking: stabilize liberated areas fast enough to prevent famine and to free rail capacity for offensives. Women were again the first responders of civil order, organizing communal kitchens, nursing typhus cases, locating orphaned children, burying the dead before disease spread. Archival health reports show epidemics as a strategic threat. A sick workforce means fewer shells, fewer repaired locomotives. When you read a widow's petition for a sack of flour alongside a regional plan for rail reconstruction, the same truth appears: war is won by systems, but suffered by individuals, often women, who must make those systems real with their bodies. By mid to late 1943, the Soviet war machine approached a turning point of momentum. The Red Army could now plan operations with more confidence in supply, because industry east of the Urals was producing at sustained levels and transport procedures had hardened through catastrophe. The home front's kitchen war was a prerequisite for that maturity. Women's labor altered the economic baseline. They became skilled workers, foremen, accountants of shortages, and the managers of family survival. The state celebrated labor heroines, but propaganda often simplified what was actually a complex bargain: patriotism reinforced by coercion, pride mixed with grief. In factory reports, you see shot brigades and overfulfillment. In private diaries, you see swollen feet, missing teeth, fear for sons, and the constant negotiation with hunger. German strategy increasingly faced a resource asymmetry: fuel shortages, bombing pressures, stretched manpower, while Soviet production and manpower mobilization, despite staggering losses, regenerated. This wasn't inevitable, it was constructed, day by day, by the people who stood in lines, repaired rails, ran lathes, and made the bread stretch. A nation's operational art has a domestic grammar, and women wrote much of it. So the riddle resolves: the strongest weapon on the Eastern Front, when it wasn't a gun, was the organized endurance of Soviet women, endurance converted into calories, rail timetables, repaired bearings, and childcare schedules that kept labor flowing. From June 22, 1941 to the stabilizations of 1943, women acted as the connective tissue between strategy and survival. They lived inside the war economy's contradictions: rationing that saved the front but starved dependents, black markets that threatened order but prevented death, evacuation that preserved industry but shattered families. They also navigated covert war, courier routes, partisan aid, quiet intelligence, where a scarf could hide a message and a lullaby could cover radio clicks. None of this diminishes generals or soldiers, it explains how armies remained armies. In the archival record, the decisive moments aren't only the dates of offensives, but the repeated entries: received bread, worked double shift, train delayed, child ill, machine restarted. These are the pulses of total war. The Eastern Front was fought with tanks and artillery, yes, but it was sustained by women who turned scarcity into a weapon the enemy could not capture: continuity.